some backup over here. But thank you all for coming and sharing your Wednesday evening with me. I'm really excited to be here today, and thank you to the Cornerstone and StrengthWise groups for having me here. You've all put me back together at various stages throughout my experiences of fitnessing and getting hurt and getting better, and this has been an awesome place where I've healed and grown and learned a tremendous amount from the staff here. So really excited to be here and hope I'll be able to impart some wisdom that you can all take away. So I'm going to be sharing a little bit about some of the experiences that I've had both personally and professionally in my professional and my athletic careers that relate to fear and failure in particular. Really what I'll be talking about is how I've grown as a mental performance coach and consultant, and my swimming journey that's really evolved alongside of that. At any point, if you have questions or if you want to jump in, this can be much more of a dialogue. It's a small group, so if you have questions about anything I'm sharing, please feel free to raise your hand or just interject if I don't see you. And it can be more of a dialogue. But I do intend on sharing some stories that I've learned along the way that I think can kind of capture some of the lessons that we as mental performance coaches impart to the folks that we work with. To me, I've always learned best through stories and storytelling, and so I'll try to impart some skills through those stories and the morals in those stories. A little bit about me though. Of course, my hype man did a tremendous job, but I'll go a little further back. I grew up in a very water-loving household in Southern California. Absolutely loved the beach and the ocean. Did a lot of junior lifeguards and open water swimming as a youngster, but really pool swimming was the name of the game in our household. My sisters and I were all pool swimmers, but I was really a late bloomer. And as you can tell, I'm certainly not Michael Phelps' height or anything like that. So I had to find other ways to compensate for not necessarily being very naturally gifted or talented. And my pool swimming journey was really strife with challenge and adversity. I wasn't the fastest. I constantly was getting cut out of groups and not making cuts to go to certain meets. Really faced a lot of challenges. And what I came to learn later in life, especially going into graduate school studies, was that a big part of my challenges there were due to the mental game. I just simply wasn't performing at a very high level mentally. I hadn't learned a lot of these things that we now know that we can coach and train and grow skills in. But back then it was not really something that was talked about much. I certainly hadn't been exposed to it until later after my pool swimming days were over and I'd exhausted my college eligibility. So as I was in graduate school studying for what I thought was a master's degree in coaching, that was what I initially wanted to do. I wanted to coach swimmers. I really still loved the sport even though it hadn't always loved me. And I took my first applied sports psychology class. Back then it was called applied sports psychology. Now we call it the field of mental performance. And just completely opened my mind to all the things I wish I'd known. Immediately started applying it to my coaching. I was coaching at an elite club swim team back in Southern California at the time, the Irvine Nova Aquatics, and saw tremendous improvement in the swimmers that were applying some of these skills. And I wasn't even doing formal mental performance coaching. I was just simply infusing some of these lessons around confidence, breath work, reset routines, presence, meaning through my work as a coach. And that started getting the gears turning. I've always been a skeptic at heart, and part of me wondered, like, man, is this stuff really real? I mean, I'm seeing it work, I'm learning about it in the classroom. I kind of had the itch to get back there and compete again. And so I wanted to just test it out, right? I was a late bloomer, I never really found my stride as a swimmer. Why don't we see if I can, scratch a little bit more of that potential and see where those limits are. So that's what really drove me back to open water, was this quest to kind of learn in my personal swimming laboratory. Do these skills in mental performance work? Can it take an average or sub-average swimmer and essentially evolve into something that's maybe a little bit more skilled? And it turns out as I did that, I got better. I improved skills in mental performance. They translated into faster swimming performances. Post-collegiately was PRing in swims that were my events as a college swimmer, which is very rare for women swimmers particularly, to be doing that in my late 20s and early 30s. And then also got into this really fascinating world of long-distance marathon swimming. So marathon swimming is defined as anything over a 10K. although they go much, much longer. And I unfortunately found that I had a knack for something in the 20s miles. So it took a long time. But essentially you're swimming from point A to point B, usually crossing some sort of channel, connecting the dots on a map. That was really what the allure was for me, going from one place to another just with your body. Your cap, your goggles, your swimsuit, that's it. No wetsuits allowed. And that's really where I found this love of not just open water swimming, but also applying mental performance. And that's when I realized this was what I wanted to do professionally. As I got more skilled in the water, I realized, man, this is something I really wish I'd known about earlier. And wouldn't it be cool if I could make a career of giving back and teaching others about some of these things that have had such an impact on me? So that's a little bit about how I discovered these professional passions that have allowed me to work with some really, really impressive populations, some really phenomenal folks that I've gotten to meet, coaches, athletes, officers, cadets, stories here from West Point, Northwestern now, and heading to pilot school after this, which is just phenomenal. And it's just been amazing to learn from these different types of performers. And what I've found in working with all these different performance populations, from special forces officers that were coming back to rotate in at West Point and teach, to cadets that were going off to do really high performing elite things, to football players down the street that are pursuing a career in the NFL or Big Ten accolades, to some of the executives that I work with. Myself, my experiences as a swimmer, what I've learned is we have far more in common in terms of the mental game than we have in difference. The challenges that a C-suite executive experiences as they're preparing for an important board meeting and going into an intimidating client situation are really similar to what I experienced standing on the beach at midnight on Catalina Island facing the shores of Southern California, right? The skills that it takes to do these things are very different, but the mental game is really similar. So that's really what I'll be sharing about today. And then I threw in a little note last minute, but I did retire from marathon swimming in 2021, although I put retire in loose quotes because it's an old ladies game, and maybe I'll come out of retirement one day. But right now I'm really focused on improving athleticism on land, and so my journey as of late has been in the CrossFit space. Right now we're going through the CrossFit Open, if anybody's familiar with the sport, and so we're sort of in our early stages of competition, and that's been a really fun thing that has not always been kind to my body, but it's been really fun to be a novice at something new and bring what I call white belt mentality to performance. And I was certainly, I'd had my fill with swimming by the end of 2021. I think you'll see why in a moment. All right, so this is just a general outline of some of the themes that I hope to impart today. But again, I'm going to be focusing primarily on fear and failure. The others are really bullets to just structure some of the stories that I think are helpful for helping us navigate around fear and failure in our performances. I'll start out with sort of my first marathon swim. So back in 2008, I was training for the Catalina Channel. That was the first big marathon swim that I had set my sights on, and really the first time I wondered if can I actually evolve into a high-level swimmer, right? Is this possible just from tinkering with the mental game, from learning some of these skills, from applying what I was learning in the classroom? I had this professor, the pivotal one that really changed the course of my professional interests, that used to say, he would stand up at the podium and say, confidence is a choice, attitude is a decision. He was an incredible man. He was one of the founding fathers of American applied sports psychology. Worked with the Angels for 17 years, and then followed Joe Madden over to Tampa and then the Cubs, and was here when they won it all, when they won the World Series. So he was talking mental skills of baseball, and I was sitting there thinking like, well, yeah, that's nice. I can maybe decide to be confident as I step into the box, but what about when things hurt and I'm in pain and it's the middle of the night and I'm still swimming and I'm nowhere near land, right? Is confidence really a choice? I wasn't sure. And he, challenged us in so many ways. And he said, well, just try it, right? Next time you're not feeling so great, just see if you can imagine, what would a confident swimmer feel like? How would they hold their body? What would they be saying to themselves? What would their tone of voice be when they were communicating with others? And maybe just try a couple of those things on. And sure enough, as I tried this and experimented with it, I found that dang, I actually feel a little bit better. Or maybe I just feel less shitty. And that translated into a better performance. And then I felt more confident. And it was just this spiral that was going the right way for once. I applied this to this swim in many ways, and one of those was the finish. The finish of this swim is really harrowing. You've been swimming for anywhere between 8 and 15 hours, depending on what the conditions are that day. You really don't know. The conditions have such a big impact. And you've been horizontal. And you started at midnight, and you're probably maybe underfueled or have a queasy stomach, and now you're expected to scramble up these mossy rocks. The swim is not over until you have cleared wet rocks or sand. You have to reach dry land for it to be official, and no one can help you. So even though on the other side, you can't see it in the photo, there were dozens of people that were out there watching people finish. None of them could touch me, even if I slipped and fell and ate it. Right? And you can't let them touch you because it disqualifies you. Wouldn't that be tragic? Right? Some do-good Samaritan just helping you up, and then all of a sudden that's it. No more swim. Got to try again another day. Anyways, 9 hours later for me on this particular day, I found myself trying to scramble up these rocks. But what you don't see in this photo is that I had seen this probably 100 times before it happened. I'd seen it under all sorts of conditions. With surf, as you can see here, on a flat, sunny day, when it's still dark because I had a phenomenal swim in great weather and finished really quickly, or when it's still dark because I'd had a terrible swim and it was rough weather and I was there for the next night. I'd envisioned this so many times, and I'd use this skill of imagery, which is a great tool for building confidence. If ever you're not certain about how a performance is going to go, if you can envision it in just a few different types of ways and really use immersive visualization, meaning incorporating all of the senses, what does it sound like to be out there? The cap covering your ears, the water still a little bit lodged in there, the sound of surf crashing on the rocks and the people around you that might be cheering for you. What does it feel like? The cool water dripping off your skin as you're emerging from the water, the suit that's chafing because it's been there for hours and you're in salt water so it rubs. What are the scents? What does it smell like? The crisp, fresh ocean air, right? What are all of the senses? And if you can do this for a performance that you're particularly nervous about, it can really help feel confident going into it. So by the time I got there, I had the most odd experience. It was like the rocks were just finding my hands and feet. I wasn't actually searching for the rocks. It was probably the most graceful a swimmer's ever looked. No, I'm kidding. I rarely look graceful. But I just scampered up the rocks as though the rocks were meant for my hands and feet. And it was such a surreal experience of, wow, that's weird. That's kind of cool. And it had nothing to do with the conditions or the weather, the preparation. It was all mental preparation, right? This is a beach you couldn't access, so I couldn't get there, except for swimming there from Catalina Island. And so to have seen it that many times, I think really impacted that performance. So confidence is a choice. There's a lot of things we can do to impact our confidence, right? Everything from the way we carry ourselves to the voices in our head, the way we talk to ourselves, but absolutely the power of imagery. And especially incorporating as many senses as possible can help us feel confident for a given performance. So I was really fortunate. That swim ended up being a really fast time that year. I had great weather, but I also trained my butt off, so it was a little bit of luck and a little bit of hard work coming together to create a really fast time, and that opened up a lot of doors. I thought I'd just be a one-and-done marathon swimmer, but it turns out that when you have a fast swim, you get all these other opportunities, and the bug bits, as they say. So I kept training. That's me and my uncle, who was my training partner when I lived back there. And as you can see, he's edging me out just a bit. And that's frustrating because he's an old man. No, I'm kidding. He's actually a really fast swimmer, but still faster than me in this picture, so it's frustrating. And one of the things that I used to try to channel was this quote, keep the pleasure greater than the pressure, right? The pressure's fine, it's gonna be there, right? And we ought to have it, right? The nerves mean we care, and anytime we're doing something we care deeply about, we're gonna feel a bit of that. But if we can marry that with the pleasure of the activity, with the excitement, the joy, the anticipation, the optimism, then we create a really high-performing state. And so that was something that I tried to do anytime I was faced with any adversity. And there were many forms of it, right? And here, frustration, right? There were also instances where there was fear. There were instances where there was anxiety, where there was worry, uncertainty about the future. That's the beauty of open water swimming, is you just never know what you're gonna get. The weather can change on a dime, and you can certainly face into a head current or a headwind that's just as strong as any swimmer. So you might be swimming in place. The year before I did my first Catalina Channel crossing, I was on the boat crewing for someone else. And it was great because we took a little picture of the monitor because it said time to destination. It was infinity because it was being divided by 0 because it was moving nowhere, right? And then sometimes it would oscillate between that and 362 days or something, right? It was just this astronaut, the rate of which he was covering ground was so slow that if you projected it out, he was never going to make it. Now, of course, he was able to swim in place long enough to break through that current, but you just don't know. And so that took what would have otherwise been, a 10, 11, 12-hour swim and made it a 15-hour swim because he just had hours of swimming in place. This stuff happens, and we can't let it get to us, right? There's a model that my mentor used to talk about, specific to baseball, so I had to shorten it. He called it the R's. It's very long, lots of steps. I'll send these out in the slides later for those of you interested and who want to dive deep. For swimming, because it's a fluid performance, I found I just didn't have the time that a baseball player might in between at-bats, or that a pitcher might in between outings. And so I condensed it to the 3 R's, which I use to this day: recognize, release, and refocus. Anytime we're faced with something that throws us off our game, an adversity, a setback, a fear, a distraction, a frustration, we've got to recognize it, right? We've got to first identify what is it and sit with it for a bit, especially when we have the time and the bandwidth to do so. Once we've processed it, then we've got to find a way to release, to let it go. Clench the fist and release it, or some sort of kinesthetic mechanism can be really valuable. While swimming, I couldn't always do that, so sometimes I'd just forcefully exhale into the water and just get it out. And then refocus. What is it that I'm doing? What is my aim here? Right? Sometimes we can just refocus on the movement itself. Right? For me, focusing on something technical, like keeping a good high elbow catch on my stroke underwater and visually seeing that was a great way to refocus. If we're in the boardroom on an intimidating call with a client, maybe the refocus is our notes. Maybe it's just rolling the shoulders back. If we're weightlifting, if we're approaching the barbell, maybe we have a focal point, something that we can look out to off to the distance, something that we can place our gaze on. Whatever that is, that third R is really where we land. There were plenty of times where I had to use this because of little critters. So this might sound funny, being someone that spent, really 2 decades pursuing a career in open water swimming, but my biggest fear still to this date is sharks. And of course, if you're afraid of sharks, anytime there's a large body swimming with you, you think it's a shark, even if it's cute like this. No, we had quite a few harbor seals and California sea lions that were curious about what we were up to and would sometimes come around. And it was an incredible experience, but always spiked my heart rate through the roof, like unsustainable heart rate, like in the 200s. I used to wear a Garmin so I could track the data. And it would take a bit to come back down to a more sustainable pace, but I knew that this was a skill I needed to work on, because if you're doing a marathon swim and you find your heart rate in the 200s, you have problems. Now and later also. So I knew I needed to work on this. So I ended up meeting with a sports psychologist at Cal State Fullerton. This is where I was teaching post-grad school, and started meeting with this professor. And he taught me about exploring your fears rather than allowing them to encompass you, right? Moving towards them and really learning about them. When he suggested this, right, that maybe I explore a little bit about shark behavior, maybe learn a little bit, maybe study them, maybe look at what they look like, I was terrified. I was like, that's the last thing I want in my browser history. Right, is anything to do with shark. I don't want to see a picture of a shark. Like, looking at this would have spiked my heart rate back then. But he persisted. No, I think it'll really be helpful if you can just develop a little bit more knowledge around sharks, what they're motivated by, how they behave, what an aggressive shark looks like, what a non-aggressive shark looks like, what are instances under which they typically attack. And it helped. It was incredible. I finally leaned in and started exploring my fear. Turns out, this is a Galapagos shark, and I have a picture of it because it became particularly handy to know what this looked like. You see, this was back when I was preparing to do another swim between 2 islands in Hawaii, from Kauai to Niihau, the Forbidden Island. And we knew that this was going to be a particularly challenging swim for a number of reasons. One, it's just big open Hawaii ocean. You don't have the protection of the coast like so many of the swims I had been doing in Southern California or near other large land masses. So the water was going to be rough. There was also going to be incredible visibility. Most people that knew I swam in Southern California were like, well, don't you see sharks all the time? And I was like, well, maybe, I don't know, I don't see them. The visibility's not that great. But in Hawaii, I knew I wouldn't be able to hide. I wouldn't be able to just fly blind like that. The visibility there is 80 to 100 feet. And sure enough, when we took off, it was the middle of the night, so you just didn't know, so you could hide. Swimming at night is just an unreal experience. But then the sun starts to come up and you get this gorgeous, deep blue Hawaiian water. You can see for meters. You can see everything. We were several hours off the coast, so there wasn't much going on. So it was really curious when all of a sudden there was like a little gray fish really far away. And we thought, oh, that's interesting. How is it so far from land? And it started getting closer and closer and closer, and sure enough, we're like, man, that's a pretty large fish. And it keeps getting closer and closer until all of a sudden it's 20 to 30 feet below us, and that's when we realize this is no fish. I mean, it is. It's the man in the gray suit. And the four of us who were swimming side by side, a tandem swim because it's warm enough water to allow for that, had actually come up with a shark plan. We had talked about it before. Our contingency plans, a great way to deal with any sort of fear or unknown situation. If this, then that, right? Kind of like coding. We knew that there were a couple of shark breeds that we were uncomfortable with. If we had seen a tiger shark or a bull shark, that would have been an immediate exit the water, right? You get disqualified if you get on the boat, but we weren't going to take any chances with breeds that have a history of being really unpredictable and sometimes just mean for no reason. If it were a great white shark or any other type of shark, we were going to stay in the water unless we saw signs of aggressive shark behavior, which we also studied and agreed what that looked like. And I know you think, why wouldn't you go out if it's a great white shark? They're actually not the most aggressive creatures. They're kind of like dogs. They're curious. Of course, the problem with a curious shark is, you know, the result really, intent doesn't matter, right? It's about impact. We developed what were called fear statements. We knew that if we saw something, we needed to have a couple of tools to come down from that heart rate spike, to get back into sustainable marathon swimming, because swimming like a 50-meter specialist wasn't going to get us to Nihao. And we each had a couple of our own. Bill Godding, one of the OGs, a prolific Hawaiian marathon swimmer, popped his head up, and this is at one of our feeding breaks, right? So every half hour you stop, tread water, and take on nutrition that your kayaker has passed to you. You can't touch the kayak or the boat, but they can pass you things and you can toss it back. And we see this shark, we've communicated it to our boat, and at the next feeding stop, Bill just says very calmly, well, I've lived a good life. I was like, I'm 24. That's not gonna work for me. He's a little older. But it was beautiful, it was very calming, and it was meaningful for him, right? I'd prepared a couple as well. One of my favorites, shark you see isn't the one you need to worry about. Thank you, Dr. Wiersma, for helping me learn about shark behavior. They attack from behind and below at about 30 to 40 miles an hour, depending on the species, right? They are predators. They don't want you to know that they're coming. And so this shark that had behaved really differently, that had kind of slowly crept up from the depths, and by the way, was still going at our pace, which is phenomenal, right? Sharks are graceful swimmers, and humans are just not. I don't care how good of a swimmer you are, we are not aquatic beings. We're like thrashing around the surface, and this shark's like going at our pace. It was beautiful. This shark ended up staying with us for 3 hours. The equivalent would be if on your way to your car tonight, you were walking across the pavement and you saw this slug, right? Because it's wet, it's rainy, it's kind of crummy weather, and you saw a slug just on the sidewalk. And you can walk much faster than the slug can cross the sidewalk, but instead you choose to spend the next 3 hours hovering over it. And the slug's like, oh my God, there's a human. The shark you see isn't the one that's gonna get you, right? This guy was not worrisome for us, although occasionally he would leave and come back, and I didn't like that. If you make it to the beach, you've already beaten the odds. This was great for a Southern California swimmer, right? Like, you know, the traffic and the freeways and all of that. Like, if I got there to the beach, like, you know, I'd beaten the odds for the day. Just learning about statistics and risk and incidents, right, was far more likely to be harmed in some other type of way. Make your decision on the beach, One of my mentors that was another marathon swimmer taught me that as you're putting on your cap and goggles, that's a great time to review risk and reward. Is this swim worth the risk? And so this was part of my routine as I prepared for this swim. And so at 4 in the morning when we were getting our stuff on, I was going over it in my mind. I know the risks, we've talked about it, we have a plan for it, but I also know the reward and why I'm doing it. I know what my purpose is here. And I know what we're trying to achieve here, being the second set of 4 swimmers to do this crossing. And so that's what we became, 5 through 9, or 5 through 8. Make your decision on the beach.
Can I ask something?
Yeah,
The
please.
risk doesn't stay the same. Because like
True.
the risk is different when you're injured, or it's different when the shark is close, versus
Yeah.
when you're on the beach and it's a theoretical risk.
That's true. Yeah, that's fair. I think what helped us is we'd already planned out this scenario. We'd already talked about, we didn't talk about all the breeds of shark, but this wasn't on our no list, right? It wasn't on our, hit the panic button list. If we'd seen a tiger shark, if we'd identified that, we would have gotten out. And that was what we talked about the couple days before. And so, yeah, it was, I think, reviewing some of that risk conversation, our shark contingency plan. And because it was a breed that we were comfortable with, I mean, as comfortable as you can be, we stayed in. But you're right, anyone could have hit that panic button at any point and gotten on the boat and ended their swim right there. And that would have been fine. I don't think any one of us would have held a single judgment, because it does change. And so constantly reevaluating might make sense in certain performances, but also reflecting on it ahead of time, I think, is helpful too. The one that really helped me, and the one that I worked hard to not just plan and prepare for, but use, might sound silly, but people pay good money for this. And what it meant to me is, people do pay enormous amounts of money to go shark diving and to go view sharks. And we move heaven and earth to make that happen for a lot of people by putting sharks in captivity or chumming the oceans and then bringing people around them, both of which are really bad for the creatures. And I was getting to do this in their environment. Mother Nature was allowing me into this space. And this shark was choosing to spend its day with us. This is an unforgettable experience I was never going to forget. I can still see it, the outline of it and the way it moved. And so as I kind of leaned into my breathing and leaned into these fear statements, I was finally able to get composure by realizing how fortunate this was. And what a once-in-a-lifetime, I hope, experience this was. Right? And it was truly special. It really was. It was allowing us to be with it. And it was just this incredible otherworldly thing that I'm very well aware not a lot of people get to do. And here I was. I got to do this. So, fear statements, another strategy that we can use to prepare for any sort of fear-producing experience. Another one is our purpose. This is a picture of night swimming. That's exactly what it looks like. We have glow sticks on us so that the crew can find us and make sure that they've always got eyes on us. But it's as little light as possible because light attracts life. And we don't necessarily want to attract too much of that. But to me, this was where a lot of my purpose came from. That connection with nature, that ability to be in this really special, unique place. One of the most magical things about night swimming is the bioluminescence that appears, especially on a cloudy or a moonless night. Right? As you pull your hand through the water, all these plankton are agitated and they light up. And there's this fluorescent strain of bubbles that you can see as you pull your hand through, or anywhere else that you're moving through the water. If anyone's experienced it, it's truly magic. And especially when you're out there in these remote places, like the start of Catalina where this picture's from. There's no cities out there, it's just a campsite. Once you're a couple hundred meters away from the beach, you can't see anything. It's so dark that you can't even tell what's water and what's the black sky above you, especially if there's clouds out and you can't see the stars or the moon. And so all you're seeing is this bioluminescence, and you're in this really sensory deprived state. And you just have time to ponder and to be present and to reflect. And to me, night swimming was one of the places where I felt like I was able to commune with nature. I was able to be here in this space, again, welcomed by Mother Nature. I have no delusions. No matter how fast a swimmer you are, if Mother Nature doesn't let you cross, you're not getting across, right? The failure rate in these swims can be quite high. But I'd experienced a lot of success up until this point. And so I experienced one of the biggest blows in my career in 2012. I was taking off swims around the globe and finally thought it was time to try my hand at the English Channel. And I thought that because when I told people what I did and when I, talked to other swimmers, everybody asked me, well, when are you doing the English Channel? I was like, I guess I better do the English Channel. It was just sort of like an obligation. And so I went to go check the box and found that it was a little bit harder to check than I thought. I had some really difficult experiences over there, and it was really the first time I hit incredible amounts of adversity in one swim that I wasn't able to overcome. And to me, it was the biggest failure of my career, really the biggest failure of my life up until that point. I started swimming on a crisp, cool 56-degree day. That was the water temperature. I'd prepared for about 60 to 62, but it was an uncommonly cold early summer. It was early July. I'd also gone far earlier in the season than I was supposed to. The pilot had called and said, hey, we got a swimmable day. And I'd been taught, hey, you go. If you get the opportunity, you just take it. You deal with the rest later. I got 12 hours in, and those 12 hours were wonderful. I was swimming the English Channel. I felt fine. I felt great. And then all of a sudden, I have this loss of memory. I have this gap where I don't really know what's going on, and things get fuzzy. And I wake up, and I'm in the car, and I don't really understand why. And we're driving to the hospital very fast in a foreign country on the wrong side of the road. And I end up in the hospital. So long story short, I experienced what's called cold water pulmonary edema, really similar to what climbers get. Essentially, I just got really, really cold for a really long time and aspirated a lot of water. I don't remember because there's a little bit of memory loss involved with it. But there were some things that stood out. I remember very clearly the sun was setting and the crew handed me a glow stick with a safety pin, which is how you affix it to your suit, the back of your suit so that the crew can see it, and the safety pin's open. So imagine I'm 4 feet down below the hull of the ship. And my crew is, and I'm just losing it, right? I have no idea what my name is or where I am. But my crew is handing me a safety pin that's open with a glow stick because it's dark. And I remember telling myself in my mind, okay, Jen, now you really have to do this well because you can't let them see. It was sort of I know this has happened to nobody here, but if you've ever been intoxicated around your parents and you don't want them to know. And so you do everything with precision, right? Fix it right here. Okay, good, I've got it. Fooled them. I don't know why. I should have just said something. I never thought I would be the person that swam myself to the hospital, but here I was trying to conceal symptoms of hypothermia. Next memory is being told that the swim was over, that I wasn't going to make it. And then I remember pleading with the pilot, no, let me just swim in place and break through this current, because this is one of the classic swims where you might do a 6-hour stint swimming into the current before the tide shifts again and you're able to get to land. I was ready for it. My body wasn't, though. I don't remember anything after that until I was in the car struggling to gain any amount of oxygen, and then in the hospital. And then when I finally came to there and started reflecting and realizing what happened or what didn't happen, it was devastation. I'd never really failed anything like this in my life. I'd had plenty of challenges, but this was big. At the time, I had a lot of sponsors. They all pulled out immediately. It was wild, right? So my ability to do this was now compromised. I was struggling to recover, right? I was in the hospital for 3 days. The pilot calls and says, I know you really wanted it. If you want, we'll take you out again in a week or two when you're recovered. So I started training again when I got out. I got to my friend's pad in London and started training once I was well enough and just couldn't do it. Finally came down with pneumonia, right? My lungs were still full of fluid and probably shouldn't have really been training. But I really wanted to take the second chance and finally ended up crawling back to the States, sad, demoralized, and just a shadow of myself. It's probably the hardest thing I'd been through at the time. I knew I couldn't let it sit there, though. I knew that wasn't the way to end the season. I didn't know when I'd be back. I didn't even know if I would be back. But again, I just kept telling myself, marathon swimming is an old lady's game. I'll get back one day. It was very expensive. The English Channel on average costs about $10,000 coming from the States. I'd had a lot of help with sponsors, but then I'd lost a lot of that, and I'd missed that opportunity. And so I came back and kind of collected my thoughts and was like, well, okay, I guess I got to finish on a high note. I can't close this chapter right now on that note. So I was really fortunate to have a friend that really started trying to get me to figure out why I do what I do. Why do I do what I do? I reflected a lot on the English Channel and really did a deep post-mortem. I had done it that year because I felt like it was something I was supposed to do. Like this community of marathon swimmers, the society that I was a part of, this community was telling me it was something that was next. And it wasn't that they were pressuring me to do it, it just felt like a duty or a sense of obligation. But that wasn't the case with any of my other swims. They all had a very personal, deep meaning. There was a connection to the place, to the points I was connecting on the map. And that's when it struck me. I didn't have meaning that year. And that impacted everything, from the way that I prepared, to my mindset, to the way that I ultimately handled adversity in the moment. And so I knew whatever I was going to cap off this season with had to have meaning. I was living in California at the time. I was lifeguarding in LA County beaches as part of their fire department. I was teaching at Cal State Fullerton, also kind of close to the area. And one day, while I was sitting in lovely SoCal traffic on the 405, it struck me. I was like, there's this bay, this whole bay that I'm driving around. I'm going the long way. Why don't I go the short way? For me, it's always been about making maps, about transportation, just with your body, going from one point to the next. And so I pulled out Google Maps at the next stoplight. I was like, zooming out. I'm like, man, Catalina's like that. LA Bay kind of looks like that. Maybe that's swimmable. I get home, I actually map it out. It's 28 miles. A little aggressive, but it's doable. It's a little bit on the long end of my specialty, but it's doable. Then I started thinking, has anyone done this? No one had done this. And I just couldn't believe it. I was like, oh man, I better be quiet until I get this done. So later that summer, my mentor and I, the one that talked about make your decision on the beach, became the first man and woman to swim the LA Bay, which is now a ratified marathon swim that you could do. But we needed that why. And finding that why turned everything around for me. So from then on, meaningful swims only. I had to understand why I was doing it. So that was marathon swimming career part one. After that, I took a little bit of a break. I didn't have any sponsorships, and marathon swimming is a very expensive sport. So I was like, you know what? I'll just do local things. I'll just focus on speed. We did a lot of relays. We set the record, the speed record from Catalina to mainland one year. Tried for like 4 other years to get it going the other way and never got it. Some other team did. But it was a fun go. Started doing other relays and shorter swims and just focused on speed and fitness. Relocated to West Point to work at the Center for Enhanced Performance, and that sort of uprooted my swimming community and who I was training with, and it took a while to kind of find a new rhythm there. But then when I did and when I felt settled, I just kept having this itch. Like, man, there's something unfinished here. There's something I have to fix. And so now I had why. Now I knew exactly why I was doing what I was doing when I went back to Dover. It took a couple of years of training. In fact, I didn't decide till I wanted to do it until 2018. And you book a couple years out. So I booked for 2020 because that seemed like a reasonable thing to do. So I trained for 2 years and then a third because 2020 just didn't happen. A lot of things went wrong that year. Had multiple injuries during this train up. It was a really rough go. I was a much older marathon swimmer and I had a lot of miles under my belt, and so it was difficult. But the other challenge was that I'd swum myself into the hospital last time, and I'd really worried a lot of family and friends. And my then boyfriend, now husband, was on the boat at the time, and I think he went through hell, probably more so than I did, because I don't remember it. So I worked with a sports psychologist to help get my mindset right, to help make sure that I was undertaking this in a safe and smart way, to make sure that I wasn't allowing the fear of repeating yet another disaster get in my way, to make sure I wasn't engaging in any self-sabotage because I didn't know if I was capable of being an English Channel swimmer. What if I became a 2-time failure? Those are sometimes the thoughts that we battle, even when we're trained to think about high-level mental performance and teach it all the time. I still had those thoughts. So it was really helpful to get an external perspective and work with someone that understood this stuff through a different lens and could keep me accountable to my own mental training and my own mental game. One of the things that we really focused on was this idea of presence and this idea of not needing to know the end of my story. And I had to make peace with that. And anytime we face uncertainty, which is the root of a lot of stress, fear, and anxiety, we have to make peace with, I may not know the end of this story. And that's okay. I don't need to. And that thought came up all throughout training, but probably about every other stroke during the swim, especially when just 2 hours off the shore of Dover, I already felt a chill. I already felt cold. Am I just doing this again? Am I just swimming myself to yet another hospital? Is this just another actually it's not a very expensive stay. The UK healthcare really got their system figured out. It's probably cheaper than the hotel. I still didn't want to do it though. I wanted to get to the other side. I wanted to get to France. I was supposed to bring my pilot a pebble. That's what you do. You take a pebble off the beach, and give it to your pilot. I didn't get to do it that time. So here I was, 9 years later, trying to repeat it and trying not to get myself back into the hospital. And I just kept repeating that mantra. I don't need to know the end of this story to just keep swimming. I don't need to know the end of my story to just keep swimming. I don't need to know the end of the story to just take one more stroke. And sure enough, said that enough times, and all of a sudden started seeing the sand beneath me. And that was just a euphoric feeling. Finally seeing the other shore, finally knowing that it was possible, and then finally the boat putting the little dinghy in the water because they kayak with you into shore, and then they tell you to start swimming left. It's this magical thing. And you crawl up on the rocks there, you find dry land, and then you grab your pebble, and you bring it back to your pilot, and then that's that. Yeah, that was the end of my story, and I didn't know it until I was there. It took me 11 hours, and for 10 and a half of those hours, I wasn't sure if I was going to finish. But I think that's how it was supposed to be. So, if I can impart any wisdom, this is my favorite poem. If I am not for myself, who will be for me? And really what Rabbi Hillel is getting at there is, at the end of the day, we have to put on our oxygen mask before we can help others. If we're pursuing crafts of passion, if we understand our why, if we know our meaning and our purpose in life, which takes time and effort to explore, ultimately we can do a better job of serving others and being for others. But no one's going to care about your passion or your pursuits as much as you will, and as much as you have to. And if I'm not for others, who am I? Ultimately, like all of my experiences of learning through swimming has simply just been a personal laboratory for me to better understand this unique and fun world of mental performance. But if it's just for me, it's not really doing anything, and it's not why I got into this in the first place. My joy is in sharing this with other people, with other teams, with organizations, with coaches, with athletes, with all of you. And if the stories can help me do that, I think that's more fun. If not now, when? Each of us in this room, and I say us intentionally, has something on our list. Make one deliberate action tonight to move closer towards that thing. Don't let it be a one day, a maybe, a someday, a later, because we don't always know that we have that. It took me 9 years to get back to the English Channel. 9 years. I thought it might just take a couple. I'm lucky I had those 9 years. But if something had happened, I might not have had that opportunity. If I hadn't been fortunate enough to get deferred just 1 year, from 2020 to 2021, well, 2022, I make the move out here to Northwestern. I'm not sure I would have been able to put together a great training year that season. Right? It all happened because of deliberate, meaningful action. So if not now, when? Life's too short. All right. I've got some time for questions. I think we've gone a little bit longer than I had hoped, but I just want to end this with saying thank you so much for listening to my stories. I hope there were a couple of nuggets in there, like the 3 R's, the fear statements, the contingency planning, the finding meaning in what we do, and the urge to presence. But if there's any way that I can help in any of your endeavors, please let me know. My contact information's here. My business partner and I are doing a summit for leaders, so similar concepts, but more in an executive and leadership space next Tuesday on Zoom. If anybody's interested, we're pleased to be able to offer a 20% discount to anyone who's here tonight. And feel free to get social and follow me. But with that, I'll open it up to questions. Thank you. Yeah.
I'm curious if you have any practices, like aside from your fitness training and CrossFit and whatever, any practices that you do on a regular basis that you feel like boost your mental game especially?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do a little bit of mindfulness from time to time. I find that helps. And it doesn't have to be like, I think a lot of us get stuck with our routine there by thinking we have to do like a full-on 20-minute meditation, and sometimes that's really helpful. But to me, I'll find mindfulness in like a silent commute, right? Driving without the need to have music, audio, a podcast, a book, right? And just being. Or a mindful walk, right? Walking from one place to another. I ride my bike a lot around town. That's how I commute around. And to me, like that's a beautiful way to be more mindful, is just to kind of work that into movement. One thing I've really missed with the transition from marathon swimming to CrossFit is that repetitive, like the night swimming, basically that repetitive movement where you can really be fully present and deeply reflect on something. And so I've worked to, create that in other ways through walking or biking, or just sitting in silence and practicing mindfulness. There's a lot of really great apps that help us do that too. Headspace and Calm are great. And I've used those and recommended them as ways to train that ability. But ultimately, the DIY approach is, what the goal ought to be. And then just daily movement for me has been a really helpful structure and purpose of the day. And right now, it's pursuing like, how good can I get at CrossFit, right? This thing that's, for whatever reason, captivated me in my I don't know, in between marathon swimming career 2 and potentially 3. I'm sure one day I'll go back to it, but this has been a fun thing to just kind of learn and try to build skills in a new capacity. Yeah, thank you for the question. Yeah, Nick.
Thanks for sharing your story and everything.
Of course.
With the with talking about like going from like your normal rate to then like 200 when you had those like shark fears, how would you know that you're back to like a composed level? Is it like a certain amount above your normal heart rate while you were swimming, or?
Yeah. Oh, it's a great question. Ken, the individual I studied with, used to say, how do you know you're in control? You can breathe. And to me, that's always a great metric. Marathon swimming is very low tech. You're not allowed to like have heart rate data available to you. I do a lot of like heart rate training, so I'm pretty dialed into what my heart rate range is at least. Like I know what zone I'm in at different times of a workout. But at the end of the day, like your own biology is a great way to check in. And if you can take a composed, deep breath, even while performing, then you know you're in control. And then also just trying to figure out like, does this feel like a sustainable pace? There was a marathon swimmer that when I met early in my career, was explaining to me how it all worked. I knew nothing. This was before my first Catalina Channel swim. He was a pool swimmer that I knew from way back when. He'd done a couple of Catalina crossings. And he said, it's really quite simple. The trick to marathon swimming is just making swimming feel like walking. I don't know that it's ever felt like walking for me, but the idea is to kind of find that familiar feeling if that's what you're going for. If you're going for like a zone 2, zone 3 feeling, like can it feel like a conversational pace? Yeah.
That's what I'm interested in too, is this intersection of like, confidence is a decision, but then there's this listening and listening to your body and where that comes up with the heart. You can't just be confident through, this isn't sustainable.
Yeah. Well, to me, like, it was always confidence in the things that are controllable. Like I may not be confident in my heart rate spiked at 200 right now, and that's a great place to be because it's not. Like you can't ignore reality. But I was confident in the fact that I knew that I had skills to get back into control. So if I was out of control or if I was where I wasn't supposed to be, I was confident that I'd practiced and rehearsed several skills, both cognitive and behavioral, right? The thoughts and the breathing to get back to where I needed to be. Yeah, maybe.
So I think it's interesting, obviously, the marathon itself, but your training to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Where in your training did you get to a point where you felt like I'm there, I'm over that hump to get to the next spot? Like, I'm going to get to the beach.
Yeah.
If I can get to this point in my training, mentally, I know that the rest of it is just muscle memory.
We used to talk a lot about making the training way harder than the swim. The idea being that if you've gotten through your training program, you know that the only thing that's going to get in your way is Mother Nature. And that's okay. I'll take that L any day because she's queen. But as long as Mother Nature allows a crossing, I'll make it. In terms of like a logistics answer, I used to plot that out before I even started the training cycle. So I'd work with a coach, which is usually just another marathon swimmer because it's such a small community. We don't really have like traditional coaches. There's just a lot of people that mentor each other. But it was nice to get another perspective. Like even if you think you know what you're doing, it's much better to have someone else write your training program, right? So getting that third perspective or that second perspective, sitting down and writing a plan, like this is what training ought to look like. We're going to be intelligent and pivot and change things when we need to, like when the body's screaming for change, we have to listen. But this is the outline of the training. And it was always really intimidating to see that, like week one of this, like, you know, there's really two kind of training cycles. There's the year-long macro cycle, and then there was usually like the build, which was more of like a 5 to 6 month mesocycle, like of prep and volume building. And early in that block, like it's really similar to marathon, you know, running. But early in that block, it's really intimidating to look at like, man, I'm right now just, you know, doing like 1 to 90-minute pool and ocean swims because I'm focused on speed in the off season. And I'm focused on recovery and stroke technique. It's really intimidating to see your 18-miler, which is often where you'd cap out at. And so I would actually like fold the training plan behind itself just so I could see like this 1 week at a time. And if I could get the 2-hour swim done, then I'd flip it down and look at the 3 for the following weekend. And that really helped just stay present and not feel intimidated, but also feel really confident. Like if I could do a 4-hour swim, I know I can do 5. Not sure about 8 yet, but I know I can do 5. And then if I do 5, I know next weekend I can do 6. That sort of thing. Ben?
Does your approach for big challenges and failures cross over into your like daily goals and obstacles, or are they different arenas?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, you mean like professionally, like on a day-to-day?
Like the way you prepare, is it different when things pop up randomly from day to day that maybe you didn't have all that strategy to plan for, compared to things that maybe you did somewhat plan for on those big goals?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, I think when we build these mental tools in these larger contexts, they tend to follow us, but we do have to be intentional about it. But those 3 R's, I use those on a day-to-day basis. So if let's say I'm, you know, all of a sudden get double booked, like a classic kind of frustrating scheduling snafu that happens from time to time, you know, that's one that's likely to elicit some amount of frustration, angst, upset at whoever is like placing something on your calendar that maybe you thought you had that time carved out for something else. Maybe that's your workout hour, or maybe now you've got to tell someone that you can't meet. Just these little things, right? These little frustrations in life. I think we can still pause, take that breath, let go of that frustration, and then the meat of it, the refocus. Okay, well, what's next? What do I do now? Like, how do I navigate this problem? And that might feel like a really benign instance of it, but when we work that process on a daily basis, we get better at doing it when the big things happen. Same thing too, like I'll do this in the gym, right? Let's say something's not feeling right or I'm not able to execute a workout the way that I intended. It may not be a competitive setting. It may just be for fitness and for fun, but it still gets frustrating. It still gets, you know, uncomfortable. It still puts you out of your comfort zone and you're not doing what you wanted to do, or the way it's not going the way you thought it was going to go. Can we slow down? Can we acknowledge that and make space for it? But then given the context of the situation, quickly move through those other 2 R's, like clench fists, let it go, or take a deep breath, Let's fix the ponytail. Someone said that earlier today. I was talking to about her reset, and then refocus on what's important now. Yeah.
What's your work with the football players consist of or look like?
All sorts of things. So there's a lot of different, so the beauty of this role and really why I was compelled to come here, I absolutely loved what I was doing at West Point. I could have stayed there for another 20 years. It's a magical place. But the exciting thing to me about this role is that it's just working with football. So it's a much smaller population, and the role is really immersed in the team culture and a part of the team. Whereas at West Point, I had 6 to 8 different teams or populations, because there were a lot of other groups I was working with too. So you kind of felt like you were just a little bit everywhere all at once. I also was teaching, and there was just a lot on my plate. It was so much fun. I loved every minute of it, and there was still decent work-life balance. It was more just that I didn't feel like I was doing deep work. Whereas in this role, it's felt a little bit more like that, where I'm at practices, I'm at lifts, I'm in coaching meetings, and so I forge those relationships in a much deeper way. That tends to make the work a little bit more informal, because a lot of it's in and around the weight room or before and after practice, just kind of regular touch points. We also do formal trainings, either as a whole team or more often by position unit or side of ball. So it's a little bit of a smaller group and more of a discussion. And then a lot of it's honestly through the coaches and through the support staff. So if we're, let's say, working on a theme of the week, like pressure is a privilege, that's one of our favorites and one of the ones that we utilized a lot last season. We'll first of all teach that to the coaching staff first, so that the leaders of the program know what we're working on mental game wise this week, giving them language, giving them tools, giving them strategies for observing the presence of that mindset and the absence of that mindset, and then some suggestions for how to coach it up in their athletes. It'll be echoed around that week, not just from me, so that they're hearing it from coaches, they're hearing it from strength staff, they're hearing it from academic advisors, they're hearing it in lots of different spaces. And you'll slowly, over the course of the week, start to hear the language appear on the field, which is really cool. And then maybe even hear it on a Saturday. But yeah. Yeah, Chris.
One of the things I've struggled with in my lifting, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on. So I've sometimes found that if I'm really practicing that mindfulness and that presence, it can rob a little bit of the aggression and confidence. And so I'm curious, am I doing it wrong? Or how do you think about balancing those two sides?
Oh man, I have 2 ways to answer this. The first thought I had, which I'll go there first because that's often the best, is there's a difference in our focus between what we call association versus disassociation, or dissociation. It's pronounced both ways. But the type of focus we bring to a movement and a performance impacts the level at which we're able to perform. When we're associating, so our focus is more on the task at hand and the physiological sensations associated with that task. So if you think about like a barbell lift, right? If we're associating, we're now thinking about our cues. We're thinking about like how our pressure feels on throughout the foot. We're thinking about like certain things about our setup. We're thinking about the way that we move through that lift. We're very much associated on the task at hand. We know that in short-term, short-duration performances, when we associate, our performance goes up, but our RPE, our rate of perceived exertion, goes down. So it's actually going to feel harder. Or sorry, it goes up, right? It's going to feel harder. But that's okay because it's short and it's manageable. When we disassociate, so now we're thinking about like what we're going to eat for dinner later tonight, or we're listening to the music, or we're thinking about the weather, or we're putting our mind elsewhere. There's a couple interesting things that happen there. Performance usually decreases, but our RPE actually goes down. So it doesn't feel as painful. And that's why you see television monitors in front of treadmills at the gym, right? And this can be a great strategy for anything of a longer than like an elite marathon duration, is kind of what we don't really know anything more in the research about. But the stuff that we're seeing for like the 2.5 and shorter duration, we want to associate. So for most of us in our athletic performances, we want to associate. But when you get into these ultra distance types of efforts, we can't associate the entire time. And so there is some evidence that we do want to have strategic times where we disassociate. And in my master's thesis, or in my master's program, I did my thesis on the experiences of channel swimmers. And one of the most interesting themes was that the more successful swimmers intentionally dissociated. So if they were working on a longer swim, right? For the channel, it's usually anywhere between like 8 and 16 hours. They would actually plan out how they were going to dissociate and when they were going to dissociate and how they were going to flip back and forth between disassociation and association. And so one of my favorite examples was this very proper British channel swimmer told me about how he was going to plan out a 5-course meal down to like the wine pairings with the courses and the cutlery that was going to be used, like a very proper experience. He was a very culinary guy, but he wanted to just plan all that out, and it would take him usually like about a half an hour to do all that, and then he'd go back into association. Like, okay, how's my body feeling? How's my nutrition level? Do I need to kind of consume a little bit more calories? How's my stroke technique feeling right now? What's the wind doing to the water? And then he would go back into disassociation.
Can you apply that to like boring, like cardio work?
Absolutely, yeah. So if you're just going for duration, oh, that's the other interesting thing about disassociation is the amount of time that you can do it extends. So when we disassociate, you're going to get a longer ability to perform that task with a lower perceived rate of exertion, but your performance will not be as good. So if you don't care about performance, disassociate, right? But if you care about performance, and performance can be defined in a lot of different ways. Like, I mean, we're here at Cornerstone Health. So if you're trying to think about the way that you're moving your body to support better biomechanics, better movement patterns, and to support functioning, and if you're coming back from an injury, then your performance is going to be deterred in that way by disassociating. So you want to be mindful about when we choose to disassociate. If there's any amount of technical limitations and we need to focus on the way that we're moving to prevent injury or to preserve health, then we want to associate as best we can. But if you know that your movement pattern is sound and you're not focused on how fast can I go or how heavy can I go, then it'd be a great time to disassociate. Sorry, that was a little technical, but yeah, go ahead.
I'm curious about a spiritual dimension.
Okay.
And your quotes definitely have a sense of that.
Yeah.
I wonder if you can speak to that more directly.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. To me, especially in this setting, I've always found a spiritual connection with nature. And I think a lot of it is that this environment that I felt really privileged to get to be in and welcomed into is just, it's one of the lesser known environments to us, right? Like the deep sea is sort of the next frontier, right? That in space, we know so little about them. There's still species we're discovering in the sea. And it's different and sometimes hard to understand and hard to explain, but you just feel this connection to something really, really massive, really big, really powerful. I can remember one of my favorite swims with my uncle, the guy that was kicking my butt in that slide a few slides ago. We were out at Laguna Beach where we used to train when I lived out west, and it was just this crazy stormy day. Like there was a storm advisory. There were no watercrafts out. The lifeguards were telling people to get out, and we had training to do, and they knew us. We were regulars. I was an ocean lifeguard. We knew that it was safe for our abilities. It was a winter day. It was like 52 degrees, and we finally get out through this like 8+ foot surf, right? So we get through this wave, and we're out there, and we just stopped for a moment because we were on these huge swells that were just moving us, this power, this enormous power at sea that was just elevating us and dropping us, and we just like sat there in silence and awe. There were so many moments like that, but that one comes to mind of like that really deep spiritual connection when you're out there and just at the mercy of nature.
And so can I ask a corollary? So how do you work with other folks around the spiritual dimension? Or do you?
I do if it comes up naturally, like especially if they start describing that. To me, I think having an ability to, like if that's part of the why, that's where I think it comes out a lot. Like I didn't really dive into my why as much. I talked about a few elements of it, but when I did kind of a deep, thorough reflection on my why, there were really 3 pillars, and one of them was that piece, like that ability to be in nature and that connection that I felt. And so for folks, when that comes up, either as a part of their why or another thing that's really meaningful and important about their performance, we'll try to create routines around like, well, how often are you thinking about this? How frequently are you able to feel that? Do you have strategies to connect with it when it feels absent? Are there things that you can do to bring that more to the forefront of your experience? So often, like that why, when we explore it and we identify it, it feels great in the moment, and then we just go on and move on with our busy lives. Versus like, no, can we create a habit of regularly connecting with that why? It does wonders for like levels of motivation, for our ability to stick to it with a goal, especially when the journey gets really adverse. And then performance, right? We know that when we're connected and deeply engaged in what we do, our performance typically improves as well. So that would be how, for me at least. Yeah, Dr. J.
This question is going to sound spiritual too, but I mean it only literally.
Yeah, sorry, that's my alarm to
When you're out
make
in
sure
the
I'm on.
ocean at night and there's no overcast sky, how do you avoid swimming in circles?
Well, so I will say when we're out at night, we have more support. It depends where you are, and it depends what the environment is, but usually there's a kayaker with you. In the Catalina Channel, you have to have a kayaker with you. In the English Channel, you cannot have a kayaker with you. So all these different federations have different rules. But if I were just going for a training swim, I would absolutely bring a kayaker just for safety purposes, but also for sighting. It's really even still hard to see them, but we put glow sticks on the side of the kayak, and then also on the arm of the kayaker, and then on the side of their head, so that you can see, like, you won't be able to see much, but you'll be able to see the 5 glow sticks on the kayak and then 2 on the person. Even still, you run into each other all the time. But yeah, it's a process. Yeah.
Are you swimming next to them?
Yeah. So I've also been a kayaker, so I crewed a lot, especially when I lived out there. There's not really a marathon swimming association here, but I would crew for Catalina swimmers out west, and then in New York for folks that did. There's a marathon swim that goes around Manhattan Island in New York. But as a kayaker, ideally you're positioning your core right next to and parallel to their line of sight, so right where their head is. If your body's not where their head is, then they have to kind of crane their neck to see you, and they get frustrated, or it just messes with their mechanics. So your best bet is to try to align yourself. And that's tricky. It's an art. For almost all my swims that require kayakers, I practice with that kayaker quite a bit. And my go-to is, I haven't talked about her yet this whole time, which is surprising, but my mom does all my kayaking for me, and she's way more badass than me. You should really talk to her if you want to learn about mental toughness. But she's done the Catalina Channel basically as a kayaker the entire way. If I'm swimming, she doesn't get out. Normally you trade off with someone else, but for the moms in the room, I think you'll understand. And then she actually still crews for about 10 to 20 Catalina Channel swimmers every season, ever since